Colonization is one of the worst things to ever happen to this planet. And that's why we got to heal from it. So keep listening as we'll talk about what is colonization, what has been its impact, and how do we start to heal from the ways it's harmed us. And we'll talk about that at the end. Before we get into it, my name is Carolyn Collado, and welcome to Recovery for the Revolution, where we decondition, decolonize, and get ready for the revolution through recovery as resistance practice. Colonization is the intention and act to go to another place, claim that place as your own, and extract from the people, the resources, the land that come to that are in that place for your benefit, for your profit, for your livelihood and existence. So when we think about colonization, we mostly think about the colonization as it began in, what the colonizers called the New World, right? So we think about the Caribbean, which was the first colony in this hemisphere. We think about the US, right? Turtle Island, as it became colonized by the British, the Spanish, the French. And we think about then the expanded colonization all over the planet from these actions. And we think about colonization primarily by European countries. The Dutch, we don't talk about the Dutch, right? We don't think about them in that way, but the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, the British all had big impact in colonizing nations all over the globe. So a big part of that was to initially come and, to name where my context and location is. I am of descent of the so-called Dominican Republic, right? Haiti, Quisqueya, the first nation, the first place that was colonized and settled by the Spanish. We were the ones who experienced the harm and violence of Christopher Columbus. And that's the thing about colonization, that when we talk about it in education, it is so separate from processing what that actually means. We don't feel the bodily impact of the violence and harm that has been enacted through colonization. Because Christopher Columbus, right, this man that has had a holiday celebrated for him that, recently has been renamed as Indigenous Peoples Day. Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbean and claimed it as his own, harmed the indigenous people so much to enact a paper genocide, killing up to 80% of the population, and then saying that the rest of the population didn't even exist anymore. And that legacy still lives on, because even when we talk about this flip of Indigenous Peoples Day from Columbus Day, Indigenous people who are from here, from Turtle Island, talk about us as if we don't exist, as if those of us who are indigenous to the Caribbean, don't exist in living legacy today. Colonization has made people very, very wealthy. And notice that I'm being very deliberate about the words that I'm choosing to talk about colonization, because there is the real need to talk about the historic impact, right? Like 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, like thinking about the 500-year back history of the colonization of our lands, of our nations. Yes. And we will talk more next about how that impact still lives with us. But colonization is still happening very much in the day. So I am using the present perfect. It is still happening, has happened, continues to. It's still very much here, the impacts and continued colonization. And what's been happening in the land of the olive trees has made that very known to many, many of us. So colonization by design has always been about building wealth, and has often come with, in the beginning, erasing, killing, mass unaliving, indigenous people to a land. So I just told you what they did to us, right? The indigenous people of the Caribbean, killing about 80% of us and then pretending like we don't exist, this paper genocide. And that's been an ongoing thing, right? We think about the history of Turtle Island and we think about indigenous people being genocided and being then displaced from land, right? We think about the Trail of Tears and this clearing out, and I'm doing quotations, right? Like this, like removal of indigenous people from their land so settlers could settle in and profit and make money and get to have their homes and get to live in the colonial project that is the US empire. It is the erasure of indigenous identity, the erasure and demonization of indigenous spiritual practices. That is one of the big defining things of colonization. That erasure, that pretending that indigeneity is a thing of the past. That is one of the big defining things of colonization. And I want to shout out in this moment the class that I took at Yale, Intro to Ethnicity, Race, and Migration by Alicia Camacho. That's where I learned a lot of what I'm presenting to you today in terms of these themes of erasure and that being one of the big things of colonization. Another hallmark of colonization is slavery and torture. So the transatlantic slave trade, the action of taking African people, right? People who are indigenous to Africa, taking them, buying them, and bringing them over to, again, what the colonizers called the New World, right? So bringing them to the Caribbean en masse, bringing them to South America en masse, bringing them here to Turtle Island en masse without anybody's consent, right? Without these individual people's consent, taking them, enslaving them, making them less than human. That is one of the big things. And doing that by race, racializing features that are indigenous to Africa: darker skin, coily textured hair, dark eyes, fuller lips, like racializing those features and making them less than human, making the actions and the ways that like African people indigenously carry themselves, like their spiritual practices, making those seem less than human, less than that of the European colonizer, the European settler. And that is a process that has like lived with us, right? Lived with us. The torture and violence to force those people, those enslaved Africans that were brought over through torture, enforcing that they better work hard for you to make that money in order for that settler, that European colonizer, to make the bread, right? So that is the legacy of colonization. So many people's labor being exploited through slavery in order to make money for the colonizer, in order to build the infrastructure that would create this settled life on indigenous lands. That is colonization. And it continues, right? Colonization is also the extraction of land for profit. So we think about some of the big crops that weren't possible before colonization, before we forced people to exploit their body, their labor for the benefit of these colonizers. Crops like sugar, rum, we would not have had that. Coffee, the way that we consume it today, we would not have had that before colonization. It is that colonial backbreaking labor from colonization that makes it possible to have the goods that we have them like as accessible. Sugar was a luxury. It was so rare, and access to coffee was not as widespread as it is now. Tobacco was also really big here in the US empire, and the cultivation of that. And again, like how big the tobacco industry has been, like one of the big monoliths of capitalism is the tobacco industry, made possible by colonization. The, distortion of that plant medicine that was centered mostly around ceremonial use being instead used to, like, hook people onto this plant being used in this way for profit, for money, so much money. And here in the US, especially thinking about the cotton industry and the brutal ways, shout out to My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menachem. Like, Resma talks about his grandmother and how her hands, and that's Resma's grandmother, right? Like, it's not that far away from us in terms of how many years ago that was. But Resma's grandmother's hands being shaped by picking cotton and the ways that that was brutal on her hands. Again, the kind of labor that was forced by colonization, the profit that was made by colonization. And colonization was colonization has been like a globally impacting, and colonization has been a globally impacting thing. Because, like, when we think about it, like, think about colonization like a startup. Like, people being like, oh, wow, look at all the money that those Spanish made from settling the West Indies. Look at how much France made through the colonization of Haiti. I want to get some. And so getting tons of money back from the exploitation of these people, of this land, of these crops, and pouring that back into the startup of colonization and expanding the exploitation, expanding the access to land to cultivate crops, to settle colonizers into this land that was indigenous, again, here, Turtle Island, Caribbean, South America, indigenous people's land through African enslaved labor. That spread all over the globe. I think about Hawaii, and Hawaii being an occupied colony of the United States, now like a state. But colony is not like, but Hawaii is not the United States. Hawaii is its own sovereign nation, but that was incredibly threatening to the United States. And the United States was like, you know what? I want this land, this resource. I want this proximity to the Pacific. And so we're just going to come and we're going to take this, right? It was never actually ceded to the US. They just took it. They overtook the Queen, the Yokulani, and just claimed it as their own. Colonization. Puerto Rico, a colony of the United States, ongoing. The Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, so many places are still colonies of the United States. This has been a globally reaching thing that has harmed so many of us and is still happening. There are so many nations that were colonial powers, right? And many of them have like seemingly downgraded in terms of their colonial impact. I think about in high school, taking world history and being taught the phrase of like the sun never sets on the British Empire, because the idea that the British Empire had such a wide global reach that the sun never set. There was always a place of sun and impact because they were so wide reaching. I think about that, and I think about, it's not on the surface, on paper it doesn't quite look like that, but we think about how much critique there's been of, the British monarchy, because there has still been a monarchical relationship to former colonies of the British Empire. Thinking about Australia, thinking about, Canada, thinking about, different nations in Africa. Like, they all still have, thinking about Barbados pushing back, thinking about Jamaica pushing back, all of these places that were colonized by the British Empire pushing back because there was still this colonial relationship. There still is. And, nations actively claiming back their sovereignty and questioning the continued allegiance to their colonizers. I was in the Dominican Republic last year, and we were on this newly paved, pristine road. Like, we had to pay an entry fee in order to get onto that road, and learning that road, the taxes from that go to Spain. Spain helped fix the road, and so now they're going to continue to take the money in the Dominican Republic. I think about in the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean as a whole, how many of our like all inclusive resorts are often like European companies, Spanish companies, English companies, American companies. The US is like an imperial force and a colonizer. Uh, Thinking about all of these companies that like have these major tourism industries, and people think like, oh, I'm giving to the tourism industry, like I'm giving to the economy. I'm thinking about again Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and these big resorts, and they're all just giving back to the colonizer. They're not giving to the people who are local. Like that is not who is mainly receiving the support from these industries. And by having this industry be the focus, it retains this colonial relationship. You know, you still have these foreigners from these colonizer nations come in and spend their big colonizer bucks, whether it's, you know, the US dollar, whether it's the euro, the pound. They come, they spend their dollars, and that still has that impact of like, we are like bigger than your economy. And so our money matters most. And it's going to mostly still be circular. We're still going to be mostly sending back to the colonizer nations. So, colonization is very much still happening. There have been all of the resistance movements here in Turtle Island in terms of expanding fracking, in terms of expanding, like thinking about the Dakota Access Pipeline, thinking about all of these intrusions to indigenous land that continue to happen because the oil people want to make their money. And so let's do what we did back in the day and continue to do in terms of extracting from indigenous resources. Thinking about the ways that gentrification is also like a contemporary form of colonization. Here is a big community of Black folks, and let's come and let's kick them out and let's claim this land as our own. I think about moving to DC and being really struck because I felt the gentrification so loudly when I was here. DC is the chocolate city. It has historically been a very, very Black city because Black people built the monuments that we so revere. Like, oh, look at our beautiful big white monuments that are here. Like, wow, such an icon of the, you know, America and this White House and, you know, the Washington Monument and our Capitol building. That was built by Black folks. And the ants, like the descendants of those Black folks, like still live here. But also, so many of them have been displaced because gentrification is neo-colonization. It is like a way of extracting those communities from the place that they have been held. Poverty is one of those big impacts of colonization. A lot of us might come from lineages that experience poverty. And if we're here in the US empire, there might be this story of like, we came from poverty and then we came to the United States and then, oh, look, like we got out of it, or we have like done better from where we came from. And the big grief to be felt there is the fact that so many of us would not have come from poverty if it wasn't for colonization and the ways that it established capitalism and the system of extraction in order to profit, where you have to work to live. So much of colonization was the extraction of our resources and the resources of this land, the lands that we come from. And so that's why so many of us like come from poverty. It is this establishment of this system or this system of extracting from our bodies, right? So many of our ancestors were extracted from to create mass amounts of wealth. Instead of receiving care, instead of receiving support, so many of us come from these lineages of poverty because colonization is an extractive system. So if you're Black, if you're Indigenous, if you're a person of color, you don't get to have access to resource. Instead, your resource, your body, your being, your brain, your cultural practices get extracted from and used to build the wealth of the colonial powers. And a lot of us who do end up getting like displaced, right? A lot of us who end up migrating, a lot of that is because of the displacement of colonization. Like oh, let's leave and go get a better opportunity elsewhere, right? A lot of us end up in where our colonizers are from, in the lands of our colonizers. So, thinking about all of the folks who have been impacted by British colonization who end up in the UK, all of the people who have been impacted by French colonization that end up in France, all the folks who have been impacted by US imperialism, including myself, right, as a Dominican, all of us who end up in this country because we got screwed over and extracted from in our home country, so much so that politically, economically, it's not viable to stay there. So we have to leave. That is such a heavy thing. Thinking about the war on drugs, that's such a big manifestation of that, and how many people are in the US because of the US's drug policies and the ways that that extracts from the land and people and makes the conditions in our home places not sustainable. So we end up coming to this empire that started it all, and thinking about the colonization from countries like Spain that had already made the conditions where we live in these colonial societies and where our lands are already extracted from, that the US is just taking advantage of and further continuing. Thinking about the extraction of our cultures, right? I spoke about how Indigenous people, there's this narrative of like, they don't exist anymore, right? Indigenous people don't exist. And then there is the profiting from our indigenous cultures and spiritual practices and medicinal practices that is then packaged and resold to us. The whole field of somatics is so based on indigenous ways of being with body, of healing body, of carrying our bodies that have been suppressed by white supremacy and colonization. The whole emerging field of plant medicine, right, and psychedelics, and that focus, so much of that is being carried out by white men who are going to these places that have been holding, like the keepers of this indigenous plant medicine, and extracting from these communities. And then they get to go and be wealthy and be like, wow, look at all of this learning that we discovered, right? Discovery being a colonial term, when really indigenous peoples have been the keepers of that medicine and know that medicine the most, ultimately, in terms of how it can help and how to care for the plant spirits. And what do the plant spirits want in terms of taking care of us? What do they need? Thinking about talking circles, there's an article that talks about how AA and the technology used in AA, of like gathering in a meeting space, it's often sometimes like a circle, that's indigenous medicine, and that's never talked about or cited in AA. Indigenous people are not centered in terms of their wisdom or experience in AA. That gets distilled and centered in whiteness. And that is colonization as well. The pretending that indigenous people don't exist and then stealing. The idea of chakras, of yoga, so much of that taken from Indian practices. And again, not credited to the people who founded that. And instead, the people who stand to profit are descendants of colonizers. So, and after years and years of violence and being told that those practices are not okay and that you shouldn't practice those, and instead you should practice our religions, our beliefs. Meanwhile, all of these years later, you're coming to us to get healing from those very systems of white supremacy and patriarchy that are keeping you from your humanity, and Christian supremacy that are keeping you from your humanity, from accessing the things that keep us well as humans. And now you're trying to get well and then sell that back and completely discredit the people that you learned that from, or not center their well-being, not give back to those communities, not center them as teachers of this medicine and stewards of this medicine. So that is colonization as well. So at this point you might be like, okay, Carolyn, but like, you were talking about healing. What is the healing that I need to be doing? Colonization has made us believe that there is no other option besides colonization. Colonization makes us think that the only ways that are worthy or valid of living are those established by the white colonizer. So we live in a way that we have to pay to live, that we have to go make some colonizer industries a lot of money to put our money in banks who receive the majority of their funding early on from slavery. We have to go and work to put money in some banks so they can make some money, and then we can keep a roof over our heads. We can pay the landlord, which that term reflects feudalism, right? The idea of a lord, you pay a lord. That was the system that the colonizers knew before they came to our nations and colonized. So they implemented the same thing here, right? Like, you don't get to have autonomy over your space. No, there's somebody who gets to exploit from you, take from you, in order for you to live, in order for you to like have a place to like eat your food and do your work. You better pay this landlord. Colonization has impacted us in the trauma that it has enacted. There is so much violence that, again, when we talk about colonization, we are often bypassing in like our education. I talked about that world history, right? And even though I know that I come from the Dominican Republic, I didn't process at the time what was the actual impact on me, on my ancestors, on my lineage. Like, what is the impact that we are living through? And even in the Dominican Republic, you know, shout out to Ruth Billon, who is an organizer in the Dominican Republic who teaches like the real history. The way that the history of colonization is taught in the OG colony is that the colonizers were the best thing to ever happen. Like, they came and they civilized us and they built this architecture that is not great for a hot place. And they are, or a place that experiences hurricanes ongoing, like, and they knew everything and they made us so great, because it is also a healing from the psychological warfare of colonization. Because a lot of how colonization was successful was reinforcing through, and by successful, I mean like they managed to pull this off, this violent overtaking of the planet, of so many places and indigenous and African enslaved people around the globe, was through violently asserting psychological warfare. So the idea of anti-blackness, the believing of being less than because you don't meet the white ideal, is that repercussion of violence. And it's so harmful growing up with internalized anti-blackness from this, and the ways that the colonizer tried to separate us from each other by being like, oh, like, blackness is awful, you should police other black people, other indigenous people, other people of color, in how they're acting, and if they're not acting in the ways that our white ideal suggests should be a thing, then you should go after them. You should sell them out. You should correct their behavior. That is psychological warfare that turns us against each other. Thinking about how much harm that has done to our self-esteems, I think about when I learned in Mexican community, there's a scene from this show Vida, which was super queer. Oh my God, a fun queer show about gentrification in Los Angeles, right? So that neo-colonialism. California was Mexico at one point before like the US tricked Mexico into giving over this land to the US. And Mexico is its own colonial entity. But that's, you know, for another episode, perhaps, to bring in somebody to talk about that on an even deeper level. But in the episode, there is, you know, this white Mexican main character is talking to another Mexican character, and he's like, you know, we took our nopals off. And if you're not looking at me, like, I'm like, he put his palm to his head and like took it off, right? And nopal, that's the word for cactus. So, you know, cactuses are indigenous to like that region of California and like parts of Mexico. It is like a slur in terms of like its relationship to Mexican indigeneity, and that being something to walk away from, to instead move towards palatability to whiteness. And that is such a grief and trauma. thinking about the violence that we have experienced due to colonization and the ways that it has made us shut down. For more on this, there's so much in Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGroy. There's so much on this in My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, Decolonizing Therapy by Dr. Jennifer Mullen. Like, all of these books go deeper into that. The Body is Not an Apology. All of these books talk about that legacy of what we hold from this colonial trauma in our bodies, the ways that we feel less than, the ways that we have been denied access to our pleasure because colonial patriarchy said that nobody's pleasure matters other than like the man's, and especially white cis men, that nobody's pleasure matters more than them. And so you don't get to have your pleasure. If you don't follow into those norms, like, you don't get to have your pleasure centered, was one of the big weapons of colonization. So many acts of non-consent because of these institutions of control between slavery and indigenous genocide, where the colonizer saw us as less than and took advantage, took control for their own pleasure, for their own harm. And that is a feeling, that is a grief to be felt. That is a deep grief to be felt, to be processed, to recognize the ways that that patriarchal violence was passed down generation after generation. Cycles of non-consent, cycles of centering, again, like not honoring both parties in relationship or all parties in relationship. Because again, another factor was enacting compulsive monogamy, enacting, like, restricting who could be in relationship. It had to be between man and woman, and anything else was sacrilege, blasphemous, less than human. Homophobia, transphobia are big impacts of colonization as well, because colonization asserted that man and woman was the only right way to be, that there was only two genders, that those were decided at birth, and that you couldn't be anything else. And so here on Turtle Island, where so many indigenous nations had and still have a notion of gender beyond this binary, beyond this like role, and expansive notions of sexuality, homophobia and transphobia exist and prevail and continue to have an impact. Over 500 pieces of anti-LGBT legislation were passed in 2023. And all I could think about when that was happening is like, how dare you have the audacity on a land that has never been about homophobia and transphobia, think that you have the right as this colonial government here, the US empire on this land, Turtle Island, how dare you think that you have the right to pass homophobia and transphobia? How dare you feel like you can continue to enact that when the land and its peoples were never about that? And yet colonization tries to convince us that that is the way of the land. And so many nations across the world struggle with homophobia and transphobia because colonization with violence reinforced that that's how things should be. And there's so much for settlers to process in this, because what were the conditions that made it possible to enact trauma all over the globe, to enact torture all over the globe? What was happening in Europe before colonization that made it possible? So much violence and so much harm that made it that buying into this startup of horror that was colonization seemed appealing, seemed like something that was worth doing. Or they would come after you because, like, knowing for centuries, having centuries of torture happening in public spaces, of having your indigenous practices as Europeans stomped out because of the enforcement of christening being one of the most traumatic things too. So then we've lost our indigenous practices. Let's go do that in other places is horrifying, and some violence that needs to be looked at, listened to. And, shout out to my grandmother's hands, which does explore that, right? Like, what are the conditions that made it possible to enact this? And if you're wanting support, I do have a course called Unsettling Recovery, where it's walking through these themes for white settlers around whiteness and the intersection with how do we recover back? How do we reckon with this history? And how do we recover ourselves back from whiteness? So I'll put that in the description to check that out if you're interested. We need to heal it and feel it so we can also resist it. Because if there's anything that we have learned as a collective is that colonization is still ongoing. Looking at what's happening in the land of the olive trees is colonization. It is the literal practice of removing an indigenous people in order to profit, right? In order to clear that land so that way a bunch of settlers can get their beachfront properties and they can be on that land that is rich in oil and that is of like religious significance, right? They can have access to all of that and get rid of the indigenous people that are standing in their way of getting what they want. The US is majorly one of the funders of this mass unaliving, and that is because the US is a colonizer nation. It is a colonial project. The very violence that is happening in the land of the olive trees is the foundation and ongoing violence that happens here in the United States. We think about police brutality and its interconnectedness with what's happening in the land of the olive trees, right? The torture techniques that they carry out in Gaza are what they teach the police, which the police, its origins is as a slave catching institution. So the same techniques that are carried out in Gaza are then to police the Black community here. Black community continuing to be put into mass incarceration into our prison system, which is the latest reincarnation of slavery here as an institution in the United States. And you can read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow for more about the many reincarnations of slavery in the United States. So when we see what's happening in the land of the olive trees, we see colonization in living color, and we see our interconnectedness with it. And we see that this colonial nation is deeply invested in upholding that colonial project. Because if we were to look at this, if we were to look at ourselves and pull away, everything would fall away. Reparations, land back. That's what people might start to ask for if we did anything but continue colonization. And so, that harm is still happening. So we have to feel it. We have to recognize it. We have to recognize the ways that because we don't hold colonization as something that has happened, something that deeply impacts us and that continues to happen, we get industries like I'm looking at my computer, I'm looking at my phone that I'm recording this on, the technology that goes into making these devices comes off the backs of the people in the Congo and the mass unaliving that is happening there in order to give people their tech, right? Like their innovation, so innovative, when really the innovation would be to continue to grow and expand and in a way that honors our humanity, right? That really supports humanity, not extracting from anyone, not harming anyone in order for a bunch of people to make money in the tech industry. No, but they rely on us to not feel that, to not understand that, so that way they can keep going. So many of us end up getting sick, end up having chronic issues because the weapons of colonization are still alive and well. So many of us have chronic pain. So many of us are in a daily trauma activation because colonization was traumatic, and things like white supremacy, patriarchy are still alive and well. And so a lot of us end up constantly worrying about our survival because of these systems. And so our bodies are constantly bracing, our bodies are constantly anticipating threat. And that is not like good for our bodies. That's not supportive to our well-being. And so that causes a lot of harm, and that causes a lot of pain, It's why a lot of us struggle in terms of mental health, why some of us might turn to substances in order to cope or in order to keep trying to make it or navigate these systems of oppression. That was big for me. And you can check out like a whole episode about my recovery story from alcohol and systemic oppression. There's very much that impact and it needs healing. When we think about the space around substance use struggles, it has particularly centered whiteness and white people as like the main people who get to determine who gets access to care and what the care looks like. And I think about the institution Alcoholics Anonymous. That's where I started my sobriety. And AA actively has like a tradition. It's kind of like the structures and rules that the institution goes by and that its members are expected to uphold. And one of them is the idea of not talking about outside issues. AA has no opinion on outside issues. And outside issues is often weaponized to suppress talking about race. And that's intentional because there was an institution, a recovery institution called the Washingtonian Society that existed before AA. And they actively talked about slavery because what has been known to our ancestors, big abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, is that because substances like alcohol have been largely used to maintain and enact colonization, used to screw over indigenous populations in the United States, used to keep people who were enslaved from revolting, from leaving, and have been used to like try to suppress people and have been used to try to suppress people. And so it's all interconnected, and they knew that, and we're debating that, but a lot of them didn't want to give up their enslaved labor. And so that institution dissolved because to contend with the abolition of slavery was to threaten a lot of the wealth and existence of these settlers and to recognize the harm that they had been causing. So I believe that there is a lot to be felt in terms of whiteness and colonization and the trauma and harm that has been unfelt in terms of enacting colonization, the trauma that led up to colonization, and the harm and the ways that complacency and adoption of whiteness has been harming folks. And again, I have a whole course on that called Unsettling Recovery. If you want to check that out, the link is in the description. Colonization has been happening for centuries. It has been asking to be felt for centuries. And so many of our ancestors did not have the tools or the time or the space to feel its impact. And many of them did, right? Like they pushed against Jim Crow, they pushed against different institutions, different dictators, different beings who came about because of colonization, because of imperialism. But there's a beautiful thing that we are being called to do now in terms of feeling how this has impacted our lineage, feeling how this is impacting us in the now, so we can resist. And so, if you want to get started on that journey, stay tuned to this next episode where we'll be talking about a couple ways that you can begin your decolonial process. Until then, you can support us and sustain this podcast at patreon.com/recovery for the revolution. Subscribe, give us a like, let us know what you thought about the episode, and I'll see you in the next one.